una archivera en la FIAF, en la Secretaría, cosa que tiene toda su lógica, teniendo en cuenta nuestra institución, y es Bárbara Robreg, y les paso la palabra a ellos.
Buenas tardes. On the 28th of May 1938, a group of people had dinner at Auberge in Paris. These people, 4 women and 4 men, were the representatives of the 4 film archives which would soon found FIAF. This amazing document, a restaurant menu annotated by each of the participants, confirms that this informal meeting was the event at which it was decided to set up an international federation of film archives. It also shows that women did play an essential part in these early discussions. A few weeks later, FIAF's formal founding document was officially issued, and the leaders of the 4 founding archives were asked to sign it. This time, the signatories of the official agreement were all men but one. We decided to start this short presentation with this anecdote. It is because it seems rather symptomatic of the role of women in FIAF's development in the last 85 years, as our statistical research on the topic has shown. Our particular interest in today's topic emerged a couple of years ago as we were creating several online resources providing various points of entry to FIAF's history, and in particular the publication of a list of 50 key FIAF personalities and the memory game that was associated to it. The basis of our strict criteria, we were only able to include 17 women in this list. And this was confirmed by first simple statistic, that of the proportion of women ever. Women indeed only represent a quarter of all honorary members to date. This is less because they have been less celebrated than men, than because few of them have had the opportunity to be actively involved in the life of the Federation and to play a leading role in it over a long period. What this list also shows, however, is that 5 of the last 10 most recent honorary members are women, which seems to signal their bigger involvement in the last decades. So what we're going to do in the next few minutes is to examine in further detail the presence and role of women in FIAF, both as a network and as an institution, by looking at their involvement and functions in the different bodies constituting FIAF, represented in this organizational chart. What this presentation will not be is a statistical survey of the entire film archive in field. Analyzing the presence of women among the staff of FIAF affiliates is not within the scope of this project. However, the history of the film archive movement is rather inseparable from the history of FIAF. FIAF's development is intimately linked to that of film archives around the world, so there are obvious connections. But the limited participation of women in the life of FIAF is less a reflection of the low number of women working for FIAF archives. We all know that many women have always worked in film archives, even in the most technical departments, than of the lack of positions of leadership, political power, as well as scientific expertise that they have held in their own institutions for most of the history of film archives, until rather recently at least. The sources that we used for this statistical research are mainly documents held in the FIAF Historical Archive, many of which have been catalogued, digitized, and made accessible via the FIAF's website. They also include the many photographs preserved in our collection, as photos can give as good an indication of the presence or not of women in FIAF activities as a graph, as we'll show you. So let's start showing you some of these stats. Note that all the graphs we're going to in all the graphs we're going to show you, figures about women are indicated in green, those about men in yellow. We hope you weren't expecting. We thought it would be interesting to start by looking at the FIAF community as a whole, and one obvious way of doing this is to examine women's presence in FIAF membership lists and directories since FIAF started publishing them in 1960. Because of the lack of time, we only examined one directory every 10 years. As you can see, women have been a clear minority in the film archive staff listed in FIAF directories, but the evolution seems positive, especially from the 90s onwards. Let's now look at the FIAF Congress, the key moment in the life of the Federation from the very beginning, and the only event at which the majority of FIAF affiliates get together on an annual basis. This graph is pretty self-explanatory. There have always been a lot more men than women in FIAF Congresses. The only exception, interestingly, is the General Assembly held online in 2021 because of COVID-19. We can also notice a regular improvement of the gender balance over time, in particular from the mid-70s onwards. These stats about gender distribution of FIAF Congress delegates can also be clearly visualized through group photographs. Let's quickly look at a handful of them. Let's start with the very first Congress for which we have a group photo, the 1948 Congress in Copenhagen. We can identify 3 women in it. However, if we decide not to count women who were not delegates of FIAF members, there's only one left, Iris Barry. What about the 1952 Congress in Amsterdam? You can clearly identify a few women in this photo. But if we remove those who were the wives of male delegates, all Congress translators and secretaries, there are only 3 left. Let's fast forward 20 years and take a look at the photo of the 1970 Congress in Lyon. We can spot 8 women. But again, remove the wives of the delegates the wives of delegates and admin staff, and you end up with only 3 women representing FIAF affiliates. A quick look at the 1979 Congress in Lausanne shows a significant improvement. Let's jump to more recent years, first with the 2014 FIAF Congress in Skopje and the 2019 Congress in Lausanne. We didn't even bother to mark each woman in it, as it looks beautifully gender balanced. After this quick look at Congress attendance, let's move on to the FIAF Executive Committee, the government of FIAF. Well, once again, the graph about average gender distribution in the EC throughout FIAF's history is quite self-explanatory. Over our 85-year history, only 21% of EC members have been women. If we look at the evolution of women's representation of the EC, we can observe an increase over time, even though women have never reached the 50% threshold. In the last decade, it seems to have even seen a slight reversal of that trend. So women in the room, there are EC elections in 4 days' time. Let's now look at FIAF presidents. 10 of them have been men, 4 of them women. But if we count the number of years they have been in office, then the situation is worse, as you can see in the graph on your right. FIAF has been led by a male president for 67 years and only 14 years by a female president. And here's the visualization of FIAF presidents in the timeline, again, self-explanatory, a lot of yellows. What about FIAF secretary generals? Well, the trend is similar. Only 3 women have held this important post versus 14 men, and in total, women have occupied it for only a fifth of our 85-year history. As for the post of FIAF treasurer, it's even more gendered. There have only been 3 women out of 25 treasurers so far, and they have occupied this post for only 10% of FIAF's history. The 3 main elected FIAF positions have therefore been occupied by men for the vast majority of FIAF's history. Women in these posts have very much been and continue to be exceptions to the law.
Now we will look at the gender of Secretariat, and in particular the key role of senior administrators. Remember that this position was called Executive Secretary until 1995. So out of the 11 people who have occupied that post, 7 have been women. However, in terms of years in office, we can see that men and women have held that position fairly. Nevertheless, we can point on something that the graphs don't show, and that is the difference in the profiles of those who have occupied this position. Men tend to come from an archival background. Georges Franju co-founded the Cinémathèque Française. Farouk Ghaffari initiated the film archive in Iran. Christian Dimitriou kept the Cinémathèque Suisse, and Christophe Dupin worked at the BFI before FIAF, while women seem to have been selected for their administrative secretarial and linguistic skills. Now, let us turn to the various FIAF specialized commissions, which began to emerge in the 1960s, starting with the oldest one, the technical commission called the Preservation Commission until 1995. So, as you can see on these two graphs, this commission was for a very long time an almost exclusively male commission, where here women do not exceed 10% either as members or as chairpersons. We can see that the Commission waited until the 21st century before admitting women. However, we can observe a very positive evolution in the last decades. This evolution can also be seen clearly in these photos from the 1980s and from 2020. Moving on to the cataloging and documentation commissions, which were, as I remind you, which were two separate commissions between 1969 and 1997. For the cataloging commission, our stats show that there was a 2/3 majority of male members, but a slight majority of women presidents. If we look at the evolution year by year, we can see that women are a minority in the commission, but not totally absent. We even reached gender parity in 1982. As far as the documentation commission is concerned, it was the most gender balanced commission, even though there are more men than women presided it. In this graph, we can see that gender parity was nearly achieved throughout the Commission's lifetime. Now, if we look at the Cataloging and Documentation Commission, so since the merger of the two previous commissions, we can see that it has always been predominantly composed of women and that only women have presided over it. And out of all the FIAF bodies analyzed in this presentation, it is very much an exception. This is also very really reflected in this graph and in these photos. And here is finally the data for FIAF's youngest commission, PAC, the Commission for Programming and Access to Collections. If we look at the future, since its creation in 1990, we can see that almost 3/4 of its members are men, and the situation is similar for its president. Interestingly, you can see that in its first incarnation in the 1990s, it was a fairly gender-balanced commission, but in the early 2000s, gender parity was lost, and it has only been achieved once in 2014. And here is visual evidence of the male-dominated membership of PAC. It seems rather clear to us that the different gender distribution in FIAF's commission can be explained by what's known as horizontal segregation. For most of the history of the film archiving field, men have occupied almost exclusively posts with high technological expertise, which explain the vast gender imbalance of the Preservation Technical Commission until fairly recently, whereas the emergence in the 1960s of qualifications in library and informative science allowed women to play a bigger role in FIAF archives, documentation and cataloging missions. This explains their greater involvement in the work of the Cataloging and Documentation Commission. As for film heritage programming, it has also been a profession dominated by men, and this probably also partly explains the gender imbalance of PAC. Now let us briefly examine some of FIAF Key's projects, starting with the Journal of Film Preservation, which began its publication in 1972 as the FIAF Bulletin. There are a total of 7 editors, 3 men and 4 women. However, if we take into account the numbers of years in office, our journal has been edited by a man 3/4 of its existence. This is also reflected in the timeline, even if you note that the 3 last occupants of this position are women. We can observe something similar for the periodical indexing project, even though the PIP was largely initiated by women, and even though the position has been held by 2 men and 2 women, in terms of duration, men have held this position for 84% of the PIP's history so far. A final project that we thought would be interesting to examine is FIAF training activities, which started in the early 1970s. We have taken 2 examples, the summer school and the more recent winter school on programming. For the FIAF summer school, which was first held in 1973, it's interesting to note that student participation is more or less gender balanced, especially since the 1990s. However, the majority of the trainers have been men, but there has been a real positive evolution in the recent years since the summer school has been managed by the Filmoteca di Bologna. As far as the programming winter school is concerned, it can be observed that there have almost always been more women than men enrolled in this course. There is a ratio of 2 women to 1 man. On the other hand, if we look at the speakers, the ratio is more or less reversed, even though female speakers were a majority in 3 different editions. To conclude, and without much surprise, we can say that FIAF has always been a predominantly male-dominated institution in which women have not been absent but clearly underrepresented and have rarely occupied key positions. That said, it can be noted that generally the women who are involved are often engaged in a significant way and over a long period of time. We can name 3 rather striking examples for 3 different periods, that of Iris Barry, Eileen Bowser, and Eva Arbons. Looking at the stats on the various training courses offered by FIAF, we notice that more and more women are trained, and we can therefore hope that in the not-so-distant future, the scientific and decision-making landscape of the FIAF community will end up reaching gender parity. In fact, our graphs have shown that the situation has, in recent years, begun to evolve more positively in terms of women's participation and visibility in FIAF's bodies and activities. This is in particular illustrated by the recent evolution of the membership of FIAF commissions, which shows that the scientific expertise within the FIAF network is increasingly moving towards greater parity. But there is still room for improvement, especially for the executive committee and the key positions of president, secretary general, and treasurer of FIAF. So let's see if the upcoming and future elections manage to break the glass ceiling. And finally, we would like to tell you that this research is still ongoing and we'll continue to work on it in the coming months. And we plan to publish something more comprehensive in the FIAF History Book Project or as an article in the JFP. Thank you.
Pasamos la palabra a Henry Caicedo y Ricardo Cantor de la Cinemática de Bogotá para hablarnos del papel de las mujeres.
Buenas tardes, soy Henry Caicedo, coordino desde el 2019 la línea misional Archivo Vivo y Memoria de la Simposio de Bogotá, Ciencia de Artes Audiovisuales y de Artes.
Hola, buenas tardes para todos. Es un honor y un gusto estar acá participando de este simposio. Mi nombre es Ricardo Cantor, yo soy el actual director de la Cinemática de Bogotá desde hace un par de años. Soy realizador y gestor cultural y entre 2014 y 2019 trabajé siendo parte del equipo de la Cinemateca en grupos de trabajo liderados por mis 2 antecesores, Julián David Correa y Paula Villegas.
Esta es una presentación cronológica que hemos dividido en 2 partes. Una primera parte donde resaltaremos el trabajo de las mujeres que dieron inicio a la Cinemateca y que propiciaron su consolidación como un espacio cultural para las artes cinematográficas de la ciudad de Bogotá en un periodo que abarca 17 años.
Y una segunda parte donde hablaremos de la nueva Cinemateca de Bogotá y de la mujer que lideró un equipo de trabajo que logró concretar la construcción, inauguración y puesta en marcha del primer centro cultural de las artes audiovisuales del país, hoy la Cinemateca de Bogotá.
A lo largo de esta ponencia resaltaremos el trabajo de Isadora del Norden Jaramillo, fundadora y primera directora entre 1971 y 1979, Claudia Triana de Vargas, directora entre 1980 y 1986, María Elvira Talero, directora entre 1986 y 1988, y Paula Villegas, directora entre julio del 2016 y abril del 2021. La Cinemateca de Bogotá nace por iniciativa de Isadora de Norden y su esposo, Francisco Norden, ambos activos integrantes del Cineclub de Colombia y conocedores de la labor desarrollada por la Cinemateca Francesa en París, y quienes al regresar de Europa, finalizando la década de los 60, promueven la creación de una cinemateca en Bogotá. Así lo plantean a la Secretaría de Educación del Distrito, y el 11 de abril de 1971, mediante el decreto de la alcaldía, se crea la Cinemateca Distrital de Bogotá e Isadora del Norden es nombrada como su primera directora. Conversando con Isadora, nos cuenta lo siguiente: cuando me nombraron no existía nada, era como el comienzo del mundo, no había nada, solamente un decreto. Había que hacer gestión para conseguir todo. La primera sede de la Cinemateca fue el Planetario de Bogotá. La primera proyección oficial ocurrió el 2 de octubre de 1971 con la película 7 años de mala suerte de Max Linder. Se dispuso la pantalla de esta manera a cines prácticamente desconocidos en Colombia. Cines de Bulgaria, Suecia, Polonia, Unión Soviética, por supuesto América Latina y Cuba en particular. En 1973, la muestra de cine colombiano 1950-1973 provocó un gran impacto en la ciudad, congregando por primera vez lo más representativo de la cinematografía nacional. La Cinemateca se dio a la elaboración de escritos y presentaciones sobre lo que se exhibía. Ello derivó en la realización de cursos conocidos como de apreciación cinematográfica. De su continuidad derivó en la apertura de nuevas vertientes pedagógicas, lo que conocemos hoy los cursos de la Cinemateca. En 1976, la Cinemateca Distrital inauguró su primera sede propia, adecuada en una sala anexa al Teatro Jorge Eliezer Gaitán, con una capacidad para 169 espectadores, actualizando al mismo tiempo la infraestructura técnica de proyección. En esa inauguración se proyectaron 3 películas: Lucky Luciano de Francesco Rossi, La Conclusión de Luis Mayer y El último deber de Hal Ashby. Se emprende en 1977 la publicación de la revista Cinemateca, cuyo propósito fue la reflexión y la crítica cinematográfica. En esta primera etapa se publicaron 6 números hasta 1979. Sin embargo, el área de publicaciones contaba ya con un antecedente importante: el libro Crónicas de Cine de Hernando Valencia Geelker, publicado en 1974, y en 1976 la publicación de 2 boletines con los resultados del taller de crítica. Aquí pues, hay un punto muy importante en el giro administrativo de la Cinemateca, y en 1971 dependía de la Secretaría de Educación, y con el cambio de sede y la decisión contenida en el Acuerdo 2 del Consejo de Bogotá en 1978, se crea el Instituto Distrital de Cultura y Turismo, y Mediante este decreto, la Cinemateca se adscribe como dependencia a este instituto. La gestión de Isadora culmina en 1979, pasando a ser la primera directora de FOCINE hasta 1982, y Claudia Triana de Vargas asume la dirección a finales de 1980 para desarrollar una labor continua durante 6 años. Seguimos las conversaciones con cada una de ellas y Claudia nos cuenta. Realmente fueron unos años muy importantes para mi carrera, para descubrir el cine y para descubrir ese amor por la preservación del patrimonio, por la memoria, por esas imágenes en movimiento que hay que conservar a toda costa. Durante la dirección de Claudia, el archivo fílmico alcanzó el carácter de proyecto orgánico fundamental. La colección se incrementa a la vez que se habilitan áreas diseñadas para conservación y preservación. Uno de los logros, por supuesto, más fundamentales lo constituyó la vinculación de la Cinemateca a la FIAF en el año 1984. Otro proyecto que ha sido de los más importantes para la Cinemateca es Cuadernos de Cine Colombiano, aún vigente. Es una serie monográfica que nace para documentar la labor de los cineastas colombianos. Bajo la dirección de Claudia se publican 20 números. Otro proyecto denominado Archivo Fílmico Colombiano, serie de investigaciones cuyo único título publicado fue el libro El cortometraje de sobreprecio, adelantado por el investigador y realizador Carlos Álvarez. Durante la gestión de Claudia continúan los cursos de apreciación cinematográfica y se dispuso la programación para funciones específicas a cargo de los 17 cineclubes que operaban en Bogotá. Para el año 1985, la Cinemateca emprende la producción de la obra En busca de María de Luis Espina y Jorge Nieto, película documental que recupera la memoria de María, la primera película colombiana de largometraje realizada en 1921, dirigida por Máximo Calvo y Alfredo del Diestro, de la cual no existe copia alguna y solo sobrevive un fragmento de 25 segundos. Al dejar Claudia la dirección en 1986 para ser la directora ejecutiva de Patrimonio Fílmico Colombiano, es María Elvira Talero quien sale designada por convocatoria del IDCT y asume la dirección en ese año. Conversando con María Elvira nos dice lo siguiente, y esto ocurre sobre todo al salir Claudia Triana. Hubo una confusión internacional sobre que se había acabado la Cinemateca. Entonces yo sí procuré dejar claro que no. La Cinemateca seguía con su función de promover el estudio y el conocimiento del séptimo arte. Durante el periodo de María Elvira conduce la Cinemateca a una continuidad en sus publicaciones, principalmente Cuadernos de Cine Colombiano y Revista Cinemateca. Las líneas de trabajo general se mantienen, haciendo énfasis con acciones pedagógicas a cargo de cineastas extranjeros y, por supuesto, algo muy obligado para el momento de involucrar al video tanto en la en la programación como en el archivo audiovisual. Y un dato curioso, un poco al margen de la cronología, pero saltando un poco en el contexto de la FIAF, Isadora de Norbe, nuestra primera directora, apoyó en 1997, con ocasión a los 100 años de la llegada del cine a Colombia, la realización del Congreso número 53 de la FIAF en Cartagena, Colombia. Doy la palabra a Ricardo, quien tomará a partir de aquí la presentación.
Gracias, Henry. Es importante la línea temporal de la Cinemateca entre 1982 y el 2006 para entender el punto de relevo en el cual se concreta la nueva Cinemateca de Bogotá. Durante este periodo de 18 años se desarrollan 11 administraciones, pasan 11 directoras y directores por la Cinemateca, que bajo su administración promueven una cinemateca diversa, incluyente y pensada para la ciudad y el desarrollo de las artes audiovisuales. Por ejemplo, en 1994 nace el portafolio de convocatorias con estímulos a la creación, que después se ampliarán a la investigación, la gestión del archivo, la experimentación y la co-creación, la circulación y la curaduría. Se crean nuevos ciclos y muestras, como el ciclo Rosa, en 2001, la cita con el cine latinoamericano en 2012 y la muestra Afro en 2016. Se emprenden nuevos proyectos editoriales como las colecciones Catálogos Razonados y las becas de investigación. En la ciudad en ese momento se liquida el Instituto Distrital de Cultura y Turismo y en 2010 se crea el Instituto Distrital de las Artes y Artes. Así la Cinemateca Distrital en su momento pasa a ser la Gerencia de Artes Audiovisuales de la ciudad. En el 2012 se crea la Estrategia Territorial Cinemateca Rodante y en el 2014 nace el programa Comisión Fílmica de Bogotá. En los últimos años de este periodo, en noviembre de 2013, comienza la formulación del proyecto de la nueva sede de la Cinemateca de Bogotá y se firma el convenio entre el IDARTES, la empresa de renovación urbana y la Alta Consejería para las TICs. El director en su momento era Julián David Correa y el alcalde mayor Gustavo Petro, actual presidente de la República de Colombia. También queremos en este momento agradecer el trabajo de asesoría y acompañamiento que Paolo Tosini, Paula Astorga, Alejandro Pelayo y todo el equipo de la Cineteca Nacional de México le hizo al equipo de la Cinemateca de Bogotá. La Cineteca sin duda un lugar inspirador y referente para las cinematecas y archivos de América Latina. La Cinemateca no se escapa, por supuesto, a las fricciones políticas en la ciudad de Bogotá. En 2016, iniciando el periodo del alcalde Enrique Peñalosa, se revela que no había un interés en dar continuidad a la construcción de la nueva Cinemateca. En ese momento, Paula Villegas recibe la dirección de la Cinemateca de Bogotá tras la salida de Julián David, director desde el año 2013. El 2 de agosto de 2016 finalmente inicia la obra de la nueva Cinemateca de Bogotá. Esto es parte de la historia y hay que contarlo porque nos sirve de referente a muchos países de los que somos denominados países en desarrollo y es la forma como los procesos culturales surten amenazas en algunos casos. El proyecto contaba con un diseño arquitectónico producto de un concurso nacional, un primer planteamiento misional, el lote adquirido y la financiación del 66% de la obra civil y de dotación especializada. La nueva Cinemateca debía construirse y hubo todo un movimiento del sector para respaldar el proyecto. A partir de la construcción de la nueva Cinemateca se da inicio a un proceso de mesas de trabajo denominadas moviolas con la participación del sector audiovisual y donde surge la definición de macroproyectos y se concretan dos premisas. Ampliar la visión del cine a las artes audiovisuales, al audiovisual expandido y pasar de ser un espacio especializado o percibido para especialistas a un espacio abierto y con oferta para públicos espontáneos y curiosos. Paula Villegas lideró el diseño de un replanteamiento de la misionalidad de la Cinemateca de cara a las ciudadanías y el sector audiovisual. Bajo su dirección, amplió y conformó un equipo misional cualificado en 8 líneas de trabajo. Consolidó un equipo de operaciones para una infraestructura de 8.500 metros cuadrados y un equipo de soporte administrativo para desarrollar el plan de acción financiero, jurídico y de gestión de información y de inventarios. El 13 de junio de 2019 se inaugura la nueva Cinemateca de Bogotá. Paula nos cuenta lo siguiente. Encontramos que este nuevo espacio surge también como un lugar de encuentro ciudadano alrededor de las artes audiovisuales y asimismo como la posibilidad de maravillarnos con su cotidianidad desde otro lugar, de ser un espacio para lo singular. Las 8 líneas de trabajo que hoy desarrolla la nueva Cinemateca de Bogotá, Centro Cultural de las Artes Audiovisuales, resultado de la definición de macroproyectos y las 2 premisas anunciadas anteriormente son: formas de ver, que se encarga de la programación de salas de cine y espacios expositivos; públicos y formación, que se encarga de estrategias de generación de audiencias y de formación especializada y no especializada; archivo vivo y memoria, procesos de conservación, preservación y activación de la memoria audiovisual de la ciudad; Media Lab, creación y experimentación, procesos de co-creación ciudadana sobre nuevas narrativas y estéticas de las artes audiovisuales; Cinemateca Rodante, que es la estrategia territorial que expande la oferta territorial de la Cinemateca; Estamos a cargo del programa Comisión Fílmica de Bogotá, que promueve la ciudad como un destino fílmico. Tenemos líneas de fomento a través de convocatorias y una instancia de participación, que es el Consejo Distrital de Artes Audiovisuales. Para cerrar, les contamos que en los 2 últimos años hemos creado el ciclo Restaurados, el ciclo Que haya paz, que es parte del legado de la Comisión de la Verdad a partir de la firma del acuerdo de paz con la exguerrilla de las FARC, y el ciclo Horizontes. Y hoy la Cinemateca de Bogotá cuenta con su primera sala descentralizada en el barrio del Tunal, con una capacidad para 100 personas y programación gratuita desde el 4 de noviembre de 2022.
Vamos a cerrar así muy rápido y nos excusamos por extendernos un momentico más. Queríamos solamente cerrar la temporalidad de la Cinemateca. Se puede medir de muchas formas. Mirarla desde las personas que lideraron sus transformaciones, transiciones, posturas, desafíos y proyectos nos permite sentir un corazón detrás, una pulsación, un latir que permite conectar con las motivaciones y pasiones que empujan los equipos de trabajo que a lo largo del tiempo están ahí. Somos conscientes que desde la génesis de la Cinemateca se ha generado un entretejido continuo entre sus equipos de trabajo, el sector audiovisual y las ciudadanías de Bogotá, y que no se ha escapado de las tensiones políticas y las transformaciones administrativas de la ciudad.
La Cinemateca es un espacio que vivirá hoy gracias a sus equipos de trabajo y a las personas que han trazado el camino desde su liderazgo y visión. Resaltamos en este espacio el trabajo de Isadora, Claudia, María Elvira y Paula, cuya labor está marcada por una pulsación que lleva 52 años y una conexión con todas las directoras y directores de la Cinemateca de Bogotá, definiendo un acontecer audiovisual en la ciudad y el país. Muchas gracias.
Ahora pasaremos aquí a doña Loti, que nos hablará de una pionera, Marie Epstein, en la mítica Filmoteca francesa.
My presentation will focus on the figure of Marie Epstein, which is generally referred to as Jean Epstein's sister. Actually, she was a woman of cinema in full shape, as she worked as actress, scriptwriter, director, and film restorer. The goal of my presentation is to showcase her contribution to film restorations and archival preservation during her years at the Cinémathèque Française, from the early 50s to 1983, in the perspective of the creation of a matri archive, or a mother archive, as Jacques Derrida would put it. In order to study Marie's career, the essay Writing a Woman's Life, written by the feminist scholar Caroline Heilbronn in 1989, proves to be a pretty useful methodological tool. Heilbronn reflects on the difficulties one encounters in writing the biography of a woman, since up to the first half of the last century, the only scripts available, that is to say, the only role models one could refer to, were focused on men. In other words, the only stories that had been told were stories of the lives of men, not of women. Or better, women's stories were centered on their relationships with their chosen other, as you can see in the first quote in the slide. As we will see in a moment, this is what happened with Marie Epstein, as she used to hide herself behind a male figure she perceived as more powerful. And this was the case with her brother Jean, as well as with the director Jean-Benoît Lévy, and with the founder and patron of the Cinémathèque Française, Henri Langlois. So, Heilbronn continues, the theme of accomplishment rarely dominates the narrative, and these stories often fail to showcase the professional abilities gained through study and dedication these women had. The conventional script for narrating women's lives depicted them as innocent and fragile creatures kissed by fortune and thus made able to achieve some accomplishments outside the domestic sphere. Nonetheless, we shall not undervalue the desire these very women had of shaping their own lives and careers, despite the self-oblivion they often appear to build. As Heilbrunn notes in the third quote you can read, each woman set out to find her life's work, but the only script insisted that work discover and pursue her like the conventional romantic lover. So this is Marie Epstein. In this perspective, I'll try to have a closer look on her career. In this slide, we see her in her 20s on the left and in her 90s on the right. This is a very short resume of Epstein's career. As one can see, she has been a woman of cinema in full shape, as I said, and we can detect 4 lines in her activity. First, she was an actress. She took part in 3 films directed by her brother Jean, that is to say, Cœur Fidèle, of which we see an image, L'Auberge Rouge, and Mauprat. Second, she wrote for cinema. She won the Pathé contest for the best scenario in 1923 with a scenario entitled Les Mains Chimères, and she wrote several scripts for her brother as well as for Jean-Benoît Lévy, as you can see in the image on the right, which is taken from a resume she herself sent to different institutions. Third line of her career, the cooperation with Jean-Benoît Lévy, with whom she co-directed 11 films between 1928 and 1939. And here you have a list of the titles. Films are available at the Cinémathèque Française. Allora, let's focus on the 4th line of her career, that is to say, her activity at the Cinémathèque Française. In the image here, you can see a letter Henri Langlois sent to Marie as early as 1943, that is to say, before she began her being an employee at the Cinémathèque Française. In this letter, he informs her that he has been able to preserve a copy of a number of films realized by Jean Epstein, which were at risk of being destroyed by the Germans. But let's say that after her brother's death in 1953, Marie starts working for the Cinémathèque Française full-time. And she is in charge, as you can see in this slide, of several major tasks at the Cinémathèque. First of all, she cooperates with Musidora in the restoration of film bills. Since 1955, she is in charge of curating the inventory of the Cinémathèque. She also curates all the printings, so she's in touch with the laboratories. In French, her task is named service technique, that is to say, she is in charge of following the printing of every single copy that the Cinémathèque works on. And she was in charge of the restoration and the reconstruction of several silent films, as the plans were not in order, and she had often were not in order, not always, but often were not in order, and therefore she had to try and reconstruct the original editing of the silent films. Among the films she helped to preserve are La Rue and Napoleon by Abel Gance. And eventually, I want to stress the cooperation with the editor René Lichtig, which was younger than her, and that she trained. So she had also the possibility of passing her knowledge, her know-how to a younger generation. Ecco, here you can read the description Marie gave of the arrival at the Cinémathèque Française of the silent films printed on flammable support, which were prohibited in France since 1950. And she was in charge of preserving, reprinting, all these, preserving in the right way, in the correct way, all these important materials. And she describes here the enormous quantity of films that were literally flowing to the Cinematheque in the years immediately following 1950. Here, this is one of the few interviews Marie gave all along her life. And here she describes the work she had to do when trying to recover the original editing of the silent films she was working on. And from here, we can read in between the lines and we understand the dedication, but also the professionality, the ability, the technical ability needed for this task, as she literally had to put the pieces together. It was as the silent films were a sort of a puzzle, and then she had to recompose the puzzle of the editing. Despite all that, and despite all these professional abilities required from the tasks she was in charge of, very often Marie has been described as being speechless when facing Henri Langlois. Just one example, this is Patrick Olmeta in the book called La Cinémathèque française de 1936 à nos jours, describes Marie in these terms. I'm reading the quotation in French. Soucieuse d'une éternelle reconnaissance, ces personnalités n'avaient peut-être pas toujours l'esprit assez critique pour déceler la réalité d'un organisme auquel elles collaboraient avec ardeur. Here, Olmeta refers to Marie Epstein as well as to Marie Meerson and Lotte Eisner. And he describes these women, these incredibly skilled and qualified women, as persons who were absolutely silent when confronting with Langlois. But it is Marie herself who underplays her role at the Cinematheque. As you can read in the quote that I transcribed in this slide, she says, j'ai collaboré pour une fort modeste part à l'action entreprise par Henri Langlois. She says, my role was really small. Vous tenez, here she talks to the interviewer, vous tenez absolument à me donner un rôle que je n'avais pas et que je ne tenais pas à avoir. Langlois était comme mon frère. So she underlines this parallelism between her brother Jean and Henri Langlois. Langlois était comme mon frère, comme tous ceux qui ont beaucoup à dire et à faire par eux-mêmes. Il tirait seul, et le mieux qu'on puisse faire, c'est de le laisser s'exprimer sans le gêner par nos propres expressions personnelles. Quindi Marie Epstein presents herself as someone who is silent, who stays silent and who, come dire, leaves room to these exceptional men so as they can fully express their potential, undermining her own role. But the reason why I used a question mark after the word speechless is because maybe it wasn't always true. This quote is by the film historian Rosanna Maule, where she underlines the fact that, of course, Langlois had a role that Maule defines as jack of all trades, quindi a dominating role. Maule underlines precisely what we have seen in the quotes by Caroline Heilbronn a few moments ago. That is to say, the fact that these women, again, Eisner, Meerson, and Epstein, had this attitude of passing under silence. They had this by the education they received, because let's say that the typical way in which a woman was educated at the times, maybe not only at the times, was to stay silent and then leave the front row to men. E allora Maule underlines this very women's attitude vis-a-vis their role in the institution. Their attitude was that of staying silent, of underplaying their importance. But as I said, this wasn't always true. This is a letter Marie sent to Langlois in 1970, when Langlois was attempting to create the Musée du Cinéma. Therefore, he was totally overwhelmed by this task, and therefore he had no time to go to Rue de Courcelles, used to say where the Cinémathèque was at that time. And Marie sends him this letter saying, you have abandoned the office at Rue de Courcelles. You no longer have time to set foot there. At least let us survive on the edge until there is a new order. Now Courcelles only survives through the sacrifices becoming rarer and rarer, which arise from the courage of Mary Merson. The anthill has every effort in the world to maintain itself. Quindi she is very direct in this letter. She says, you are wrong. What you're doing is totally wrong. So maybe she wasn't that speechless. Ecco, it is difficult. This is a difficult yet stimulating task to try and reconstruct the life and career of Marie Epstein, given the scarcity of the sources and most of all, given her own attitude to diminish her role and her achievements. Quindi in her memories, she talks about her brother, she talks about Jean-Benoît Lévy, she talks about Marie Langlois. She almost always passes under silence her own achievements, her own goals. So we have to read in between the lines. We have to interpret the traces. For example, here I am using some pictures of the apartment where she was living in the last years of her life. Here are two very interesting documents. I would even say two very moving documents. And the first one is a letter to the film scholar Sandy Flitterman Lewis, dated in 1989. So Marie was already pretty old at the end of her life. It is one of the few documents where she assesses her autoreality. She speaks about La Maternelle that Flitterman Lewis had analyzed in the book. And she says, I was making the film in this way. I took the decision of. So it is one of the few documents where she says where she posits herself as an author, as someone who is in charge. Whereas otherwise she always underlines the role of the other that was working with her, which is pretty always a man. And in the second document, it is a document where she states her last wills. It is dated 1995, so really a few days before her death. And again, here she shows her capability of making a decision, and she disposes of her body and to be buried together with Jean's and her mother's body. E quindi, to conclude, last slide, ecco, I would like to go back to the idea I introduced in beginning this presentation, that is to say, this idea described by Jacques Derrida of the Matrie Archive, Mother Archive. I just want to conclude by saying that studying Marie Epstein means not only to shed light on a almost forgotten name in film history. It also means to try and offer a different idea of history through the reconstruction of an archive, which shouldn't be the sole expression of a male focus and patriarchal authority, but that could be able to consider different and multiple sources from a female base and thus unusual, unpredicted, and empowering point of view. Thank you so much for your attention.
Pasamos la voz a Valentina Rosetto de la Cineteca Nacional en Roma, que nos hablará de una completa desconocida, pero la primera conservadora en su institución.
Gracias. Buenas tardes. I start with a personal note. I arrived at the Cineteca Nazionale almost 4 years ago, and in my research on film collection, I've been consulting many files and documents from Cineteca Nazionale archives. During these studies, I repeatedly came across the name of Lodoletta Lupo, and I began to take an interest in this person who has signed many acquisition contracts and preservation projects, but I found only a little and general information. Many of my colleagues, also the oldest one, had never heard of Lodoletta Lupo. Some know that she was one of the conservators of the Cineteca Nazionale and nothing more. I'd like to thank all my colleagues of the Cineteca Nazionale that helped me in the research on Lodoletta Lupo, looking for information in archives and the library. During my research, I also Googled her name and I found in an online art magazine a lot of personal information from Lodoletta diary. I wrote to the author of the article, Isabella Moroni, that I was interested in Lodoletta Lupo's career, the Cineteca Nazionale, and I want to make a proposal for this symposium. Because I was also interested in knowing Lodoletta from a personal point of view, I asked if I could read her diary. Isabella replied that she was indeed very happy of my research and to share information with me because Lodoletta Lupo was her mother. So thanks to Isabella Moroni for the many personal information and pictures that made my presentation more interesting. Here. Lodoletta Lupo was born in Rome in 1929, named towards the Mascagni opera. She grew up in Italy under the fascist dictatorship that had militarized every aspect of Italian life. Likely, Lodoletta family was a progressive one, and she had the opportunity to study more than a girl over her time, learning foreign languages and attending theater that she loved very much. Her family supported this passion for theater. Also, when going to the theater was forbidden for the curfew, allowing Lodoletta and her friends put on scene the performance at home. Here, 2 pages of Lodoletta diary, and here drawings. One of the drawings she made for representing the war. In the 4th of June 1944 is Lodoletta 15th birthday, and Rome was liberated. She wrote "Welcome to the Liberators" and described the arrival of Allies army in her neighborhood, Prati, and the war was over, and Lodoletta Lupo went to the university and took a degree in humanities. Then she lived for several months in Paris, and when she returned in Rome, became a member of a poetry society called Il Seminterrato, the Basement. Lodoletta collaborated with Silvio D'Amico, a very important Italian theatre historian, wrote reviews for the French Revue d'Histoire du Théâtre, and wrote a radio program on theatre, of course, for RAI, the Italian National Radio and Television Broadcasting Company. Here is Lodoletta in 1962, when was selected for working at the Centro Sperimentale di Cinematografia, an institution formed by 2 sections, the Scuola Nazionale di Cinema, the Italian National Film School, and the Cineteca Nazionale, Italian National Film Archive. She started at the school section, tutoring students, and thanks to her professional knowledge of French and English, supporting the resident professor and famous visitors.
Here you can see Lodoletta with John Wilson office. Lodoletta was a great friend and collaborator of Roberto Rossellini, and when he became president of the Centro Sperimentale di Cinematografia, she helped him in the management. Lodoletta got more and more interested in film and became part of the editorial staff of Bianco e Nero, an Italian film study magazine published by the Centro Sperimentale di Cinematografia. She did translation of international essay, and she curated many numbers. Among them is two. The one on the female figures in Antonio Pietrangeli movies, with a long interview with the director, and the other one on the influence of Italian historical films on other countries. This was realized for the FIAF Congress in Rome in 1962, and is the first contact with the Lodoletta and the world of film archives. In 1973, under the Roberto Rossellini presidency, she left the school for becoming the conservator of the Cineteca. Her daughter Isabella told me that she was still remember the first visit to her mother's new office because she was impressed by the big reproduction that took the entire wall of a frame of Lodoletta's favorite film, Les Enfants du Paradis, of course the concentrate of her passion, theatre, film and French culture. This reproduction still exists, one of the many signs of her passages. Lodoletta Lupo expanded the activity of the Cineteca Nazionale in three ways. The first was the organization of projections at the Cinema Bellarmino. Before, the Cineteca Nazionale had shown this collection, but not regularly. The second way was establish a preservation activity using the new fund the Italian government gave to the film archives. Lodoletta set an intense program for printing preservation copies of Italian movies, most silent movies. Preservation element grown from 0 to 285 in 3 years, so it's why I find her name everywhere in the archive. The third activity of Lodoletta Lupo was the relation she built with the other film archives, but at national and international level. She participated to many FIAF Congress and meetings, and in her everyday work, she collaborated with many institutions. For example, she collaborated with Maria Adriana Prolo at the organization of the FIAF Congress in Turin in 1975, and for years, despite the international situation, she had a relation with an exchange with Aura Buran and their collaborators of the Cinemateca Romana. Lodoletta Lupo made the Cineteca Nazionale grow in many aspects, aligned with the tendencies of conservation, preservation, and restoration of the time. As I said at the beginning, my colleagues that remember her told me that she was definitely the conservator. But in internal documents, Lodoletta Lupo was never called conservator, even if she had all the assignment and responsibilities of the group. Officially, inside the Cineteca Nazionale, Lodoletta Lupo was the responsible of the film archive, an underestimating way to define her activity. If you take a look at the FIAF document, or you can or the correspondence with or run. Lodoletta was every time appointed as the conservator of the Cineteca Nazionale, but inside the Centro Sperimentale di Cinematografia, the title of conservator used for all Lodoletta Lupo male predecessor and successor was never used. After 60 years of activity, she was moved in the administrative section, and there she finished her career. For many years, in commemorative publication of Centro Sperimentale di Cinematografia and Cineteca Nazionale, Lodoletta Lupo wasn't never mentioned. In 2019, for the 70th anniversary of the Cineteca Nazionale Foundation, was published a book where are listed all conservators with a short profile. In the one for Lodoletta is wrote that she did her job, and then she left with sobrietà, discrezione, signorile riservo, that I can translate with sobriety and refined discretion. But I don't know if I can transmit the sensation of passiveness and carried by the original Italian words. From this description, you can imagine a woman that's staying in her place, taking assignment quietly, with a little or known spirit of initiative, and that of course wasn't true. That's not a fake portrait of Lodoletta Lupo. We have just seen how many activities she introduced for empower the Cineteca Nazionale and made it growing and recognizable at the international level. Besides, she was deeply offended to the assignment in the administrative division, and as the archival document shows, she found a way to leave the Centro Sperimentale di Cinematografia some years before the pension. As I said at the beginning, I googled her name, finding not only the article of her daughter, but also sentence in the Italian Gazzetta Ufficiale, official journal of record of Italian government, of a suit that Lodoletta Lupo did against the Centro Sperimentale di Cinematografia for not recognize her the pension for a manager as the others in the same position had. Lodoletta Lupo was an important and modern figures of our institution, with a deep and refined culture, that did her job at very highest level, every time looking to the international context and to the last development on managing film archives. I think she deserves more consideration from my institution, and I thank the FIAF and the Simposio Scientific Committee for this opportunity.
Les informations recueillies proviennent d'une recherche encore récente, encouragée par les thèmes de ce congrès. Mon objectif est avant tout d'inscrire le nom de ces femmes, souvent ignorées par l'historiographie. Bien que la cinémathèque soit prévue dès l'acte de la fondation du musée d'art moderne de Rio de Janeiro en 1948, ce n'est qu'en 1950, lorsque la gestionnaire et journaliste Thelma de Souza Mello assume la direction exécutive du musée, que l'implantation de la cinémathèque du musée s'amorce. Elle nomme alors le critique Antonio Muniz Viana, directeur général du département film. Au cours des premières années, l'équipe de la cinémathèque est presque exclusivement masculine et composée de bénévoles. De cette époque, nous n'avons emprunté le nom que d'une seule femme, Maria Elena Azeredo. À partir de 1958, elle collabore à l'organisation de l'embryon du futur centre de documentation. Nous n'avons encore pas d'informations ni d'images à son sujet. Décédée en janvier de cette année, elle pourrait être la première femme à avoir travaillé dans une institution de préservation de films au Brésil. Neomar quitte le musée en 1963 et du fait de ses positions politiques en 1969, elle est arrêtée par le régime militaire implanté au Brésil depuis 1964. José Sanz remplace Muniz Viana à la direction de la cinémathèque et avec l'ingénieur urbaniste Carmen Portinho, autre responsable importante du musée, il organise le transfert définitif des installations de la cinémathèque au siège du musée au parquet de Flamengo. Comme l'affirme l'historien et actuel coordinateur de la cinémathèque, ici présent, José Quental, de ces premières années, l'institution s'érige en tant qu'espace influent et formateur des générations des réalisateurs et critiques de cinéma. L'arrivée du cinéclubiste Cosme Alves à la suite de José Sanz marque le début d'une nouvelle ère à la cinémathèque. Il est le gestionnaire qui occupa le poste le plus longtemps, 23 ans, de 1965 à 1988. Sa conception institutionnelle maintient la préservation au centre du projet, tout en mettant l'accent sur la diffusion, considérée comme mission essentielle en vue de la libération des peuples opprimés. C'est ainsi que la cinémathèque inclut dans sa programmation les nouveaux cinémas, y compris les brésiliens, devenant aussi une référence pour l'activité cinématographique dans le pays. Agitateur culturel, Cosme façonne un vaste réseau régional et international qui permet de résister aux constantes persécutions de la dictature. Néanmoins, il est arrêté plusieurs fois et même soumis à la torture. Mais derrière les grands hommes, on trouve fréquemment une ou plusieurs grandes femmes ignorées par l'historiographie. Au cours de la gestion des Cosme, la programmation et l'équipe s'ouvrent peu à peu aux femmes, bien que les informations à leur sujet ne manquent. C'est le cas de cette image des années 70. Nous savons encore peu de choses sur ces femmes. Heureusement, d'autres femmes de l'histoire de la cinémathèque sont plus connues. Lotus fut la première secrétaire de Cosme, recherchée par la police pour sa participation dans des mouvements étudiants et l'hommage à Rio de Janeiro en 1964. Lotus et Cosme vivent une relation amoureuse et elle l'accompagne au cours de nombreuses activités, collecte de nouvelles collections, conservation, projection, etc. Au cours d'une interview, elle témoigne de la l'atteinte constante à l'encontre des militaires. Ainsi, il était fréquent que des films soient dissimulés sous des faux titres, comme le célèbre documentaire Cabra Marcado para Morir de Eduardo Coutinho. En 1970, Lotus est remplacé par Lucila Avelar, qui restera jusqu'à la fin de la gestion des Cosme. Ayant également participé aux mouvements étudiants, Lucila est aussi chargée de fonctions politiques et culturelles. Elle supplée Cosme lorsque celui-ci s'absente, assumant aussi la programmation des projections des 11 salles de cinéma. Également employée de la Fondation nationale d'art à partir de 1975, elle conçoit avec Sylvia Estamberg le projet du musée du cinéma. En 1976, Lucila réalise un stage à la Cinémathèque française sous la tutelle d'Henri Langlois et Marie Merson. À cette époque, elle joue un rôle important dans la coopération entre la Cinémathèque de Rio et la Cinémathèque brésilienne, située à Sao Paulo. Malheureusement, le scénario change en 1978 du fait du dramatique incendie du musée d'art moderne. Malgré la présence de ces moments de films nitrates à la cinémathèque, celle-ci n'est pas atteinte par l'incendie qui touche principalement le musée. Néanmoins, du fait de dégâts considérables, l'importance symbolique de l'espace se détériore. S'ensuit une période de crise institutionnelle. Lucila raconte qu'à la suite de l'incendie, elle passe ses journées à essayer de ramener le public, invitant les personnes une par une aux séances. Plus encore, c'est elle qui garantit auprès des autorités publiques l'implémentation de la réserve technique de film en 1979, la construction de la nouvelle salle de cinéma au siège du musée, inaugurée en 1982, ainsi que le transfert du musée du cinéma de la Fondation nationale d'art à la Cinémathèque. Durant cette période de reconstruction du musée, l'équipe de la Cinémathèque est agrandie, intégrant de nombreux étudiants. Parmi ceux-ci, l'archiviste Jussara Palmira, qui est la première employée à cataloguer la collection d'affiches et posters de films, établissant la méthodologie de référencement de cette collection. À cette époque, l'équipe de la Cinémathèque compte déjà parmi elles de Lola Tavares, connue pour être l'historique technicienne film de la Cinémathèque. Avant son intégration, l'inspection de films n'était réalisée que par des projectionnistes, au Cosme lui-même. Don Orminda est déjà décédé et sur sa précieuse contribution, nous n'avons encore que peu d'informations dans cette photographie qui parle pour elle. La décennie des années 90 est considérée comme la décennie perdue du fait de l'aggravement de crise de la cinémathèque. Ce processus culmine avec la perte d'une partie de la collection des films en 2002, lorsque le musée, en désaccord avec la cinémathèque, s'autodéclare incapable de préserver les films, les acheminant vers d'autres archives. Compte tenu de ces difficultés, de nombreuses personnes se succèdent à la tête de l'institution. En 1988 et 2000, seulement 7 directeurs. Toutefois, à cette époque, la cinémathèque a été principalement dirigée par 3 femmes. La gestionnaire Thelma de Souza Mello, première femme à la direction, la critique de cinéma Susana Schild et l'historienne gestionnaire Lúcia Lahmeyer. Cette période et les années qui suivent se caractérisent par la résilience face aux adversités. Aujourd'hui, alors que la cinémathèque célèbre ses 75 ans d'existence, nous traversons une période remplie de défis, mais aussi de possibilités. Depuis 2019, nous avons débuté le transfert de nos collections vers le nouveau centre de conservation sous l'initiative d'Anani Affinir, aujourd'hui directeur de la cinémathèque. Cette évolution représente un gain de sécurité et d'autonomie dans la préservation des collections, mais aussi la possibilité de nous réinventer. Bien que faisant face au manque chronique de ressources et aux effets néfastes de la pandémie qui imposa une paralysie momentanée, nous n'avons pu embaucher 20 collaborateurs, dont la plupart avaient déjà travaillé avec nous en tant que bénévoles pour réaliser le transfert de nos collections. C'est la première fois dans l'histoire de l'institution qu'une tâche majeure est confiée à une équipe composée majoritairement de femmes. On notera en particulier la contribution d'Amanda Iorio, muséologue qui a coordonné la préparation et le transport des équipements du musée du cinéma, ainsi que celle de Juliana Mayat, archiviste qui a pris en charge toute la partie documentation. Au mois de juillet 2021, j'ai été nommée coordinatrice de la collection de films de la Cinémathèque, devenant la première femme à occuper ce poste et poursuivant ainsi la voie ouverte par Maria Elena, Latus, Lucilla, Jussara, Donormida et tant d'autres professionnels qui m'ont précédée. Aujourd'hui, nous, les femmes de l'équipe et du bénévolat, sommes majoritaires au sein de l'institution. Constatant le début d'une nouvelle phase de la Cinémathèque à l'orée de ses 75 ans, en 2020, nous avons commencé à recueillir les histoires des anciens employés grâce au projet À l'écoute des histoires. Et pour terminer cette présentation, je vous propose de regarder un petit teaser que nous avons préparé pour aujourd'hui en nous concentrant sur le témoignage de femmes. Merci beaucoup.
Meu nome é Lotus Dutra de Oliveira.
Júlia Moraes Quadros.
Cristina Mendonça Flores.
Amanda Rangel Iório.
Jussara Palmeira Fernandes.
Lucila Vasconcelos de Avelar.
Eu cheguei através de pessoas que me levaram a Carmen Portinho, na época da Niomar Muniz Sodré Bittencourt.
Eu achei interessante a programação, eu comecei a ver as programações. E aí falei, não, vou ficar trabalhando aqui. Eu comecei a trabalhar aqui também.
Eu queria mexer no filme, né? Quando eu vi o filme, os rolos, eu me apaixonei. Era como se fosse uma coisa assim viva, né, mesmo.
Tinha muita coisa para resolver, desde programa, sala, e deu problema ali, deu problema lá, o filme não chegou, manda buscar, cadê a lâmpada, cadê não sei o quê, era problema o dia inteiro, mas a gente resolvia.
Eu lembro de chegar e já ter acesso a ver um monte de coisa. Eu nunca tinha visto uma câmera, um projetor, e eu fiquei bem bem encantada quando eu vi tudo aquilo.
A gente trabalha em arquivo, né? A gente não vai esperando muito, não, né? Acúmulo de trabalho, acúmulo, falta de pessoal. Mas acho que a minha vontade de trabalhar com aquele tipo de assunto era tanta que a impressão não foi uma impressão ruim, foi uma impressão de desafio.
Eu acho que talvez a sala que eu tenho mais uma relação afetiva, acho que é a sala da Cinemateca do MAN, obviamente. Eu já programei coisas, já ministrei cursos, já fiz cineclube.
Foi ali que eu conheci o Cosme. Ele conseguia filmes, etc, e a gente trazia para rodar, limpar e botava na moviola, aquelas coisas todas e tal, para depois rebobinar de novo, para depois guardar, enfim, porque ele ia passar. Mulher dá para isso também, né?
A força-tarefa tinha mais mulheres do que homens. Quando já tem uma mulher ali, fica mais fácil para outra ficar. Essas mulheres foram ficando, né? Não tiveram medo do esforço, um desgaste físico e emocional que estava acontecendo ali.
Eu fui estagiária na Cinemateca Francesa como representante da Cinemateca do MAN. Eu fiquei com Henri Langlois e Marie Merson. Langlois entrava e dizia, você viu o filme de hoje? Eu falava, não. Ele falava, vai assistir.
Não, aí eu comecei a dominar, né? Eu posso falar?
Por que você diz que começou a dominar?
Porque, olha, era assim, qualquer lugar eu já sabia o que tinha que fazer. Então eu sabia de tudo que acontecia. Eu passava tudo para você, sabe? As pessoas que chegavam.
Eu sou da geração de mulheres que estão preparadas para ocupar todos os espaços, né? Eu nunca pensei que eu não poderia estar aqui por ser um espaço masculino. A gente tá ocupando esse lugar cada vez mais, sabe? É boa essa sensação.
Si os parece, dejamos las preguntas para el último día para que la gente que quiera ir al cine pueda tener tiempo. Muchísimas gracias y nos vemos mañana.